September 1st, 1943, Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai hovered over the latest intelligence report. His one good eye, he'd lost the other to American gunners last year, darting over the page. The words made him laugh out loud in the muggy operations tent. The Americans had a new fighter, the report said, heavy as a bomber, wide as a transport. They called it the Hellcat. Supposedly, it weighed twice as much as the Zero. Sakai snorted. Another clumsy American design, he thought. Outside the tent, his squadron's A6M0s gleamed on the steel planking. Sleek, deadly, agile. For 2 years, these planes ruled the Pacific. British Hurricanes, American P-40s, Dutch Brewster Buffaloes. None of them lasted long against the Zero's guns. The Americans were trying again with this bloated Hellcat, and Sakai figured it would end the same way. What Sakai didn't know, what none of the Japanese pilots gathering for the morning briefing could guess, was that in just 30 days, this so-called failure would start tearing Japanese naval aviation apart. The F6F Hellcat would rack up a kill ratio of 19-1, taking down 5,223 enemy planes while losing only 270 in dogfights. It would flip carrier warfare on its head, crush Japanese air power, and prove the Zero's reign had always rested on dangerous illusions. The math of air combat was about to change, thanks to a plane that looked all wrong, felt heavy in the air, and broke every rule the Japanese thought they'd mastered. And within 6 months, the same pilots laughing at these reports would be scribbling final letters home, knowing that meeting a Hellcat meant almost certain death. People talk about Japanese arrogance in 1943, but that's not really it. It was math. Since Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service had been racking up kill ratios that sounded like fantasy. At Pearl, they lost 29 planes but destroyed 347. In the Philippines, 7 losses versus 103 kills. Over Darwin, 2 lost, 30 destroyed. The British Far East Fleet's air arm gone. The Dutch East Indies Air Force wiped out in days. At the heart of it all was the Mitsubishi A6M0, a plane that rewrote the book on fighter design. When the Americans captured a Zero in 1942 and tested it, their engineers flat out refused to believe the numbers. A fighter with bomber range, biplane agility, and the firepower to kill anything it caught sounded impossible. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who'd go on to become Japan's top ace with 87 kills, described the Zero in his diary. "Flying the Zero is like wearing wings," he wrote. "The plane responds to thought, not just the stick." He didn't think much of American planes. They fly like trucks. Powerful, sure, but clumsy. The Americans build fighters like they build cars. Heavy, overbuilt, wasteful. The Zero's magic came from its design. Extra super duralumin, a secret aluminum alloy, made it 30% lighter than anything the Americans had. No armor for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks. Sometimes they even yanked out the radio to save weight. Everything sacrificed for speed and agility. So when the first reports about the F6F Hellcat came through Swedish sources in early 1943, Japanese intelligence just shrugged. The specs sounded like propaganda, maybe even deliberate misinformation. The Hellcat weighed 1,186 pounds loaded. The Zero, just 5,800. The Hellcat had a big, draggy radial engine, 334 square feet of wing, 2,400 rounds of ammo, armor everywhere, bulletproof glass, self-sealing fuel tanks with 250 gallons ready to burn. Captain Minoru Genda, the mind behind Pearl Harbor looked over the specs at Combined Fleet headquarters. His verdict, saved in the Japanese defense archives, was blunt. The Americans have learned nothing. The Hellcat just repeats their mistake, trying to make up for poor pilot skill with brute force. A Zero will fly circles around it. And honestly, the math backed him up. The Zero's wing loading was 22 pounds per square foot, giving it a tight 612-foot turning radius. The Hellcat's 36.5 pounds per square foot suggested a sluggish 900-foot turn. Japanese tactics were built on tight turns. In that kind of fight, the Hellcat looked hopeless. Then came the first real glimpse. September 30th, 1943, Marcus Island, Petty Officer First Class. Yoshio Fukui was flying escort on a recon mission when he spotted them, 6 dark blue shapes climbing in from the southeast. At first, he thought they were B-25 bombers on some odd course. Then they turned. He saw the silhouette, single engine, massive fuselage, stubby wings that looked too short for the body. In his report, he wrote, "First encounter with F6F type fighter." At first, it looked like Americans had just slapped big fighter guns onto a torpedo bomber and were flying it with the usual playbook. Everyone knew the drill. The Zero's edge was its sharp turning, so you'd try to get on an enemy's tail by out-turning them. Fukui rolled his Zero into a diving turn, figuring the heavy American fighter would blast straight ahead and he'd slip right onto its 6. That's how it always worked. But this time, things went sideways. The Hellcat didn't bolt or try to turn with him. It shot straight up. That Pratt & Whitney R28000 double wasp engine, 2,000 horsepower, which is 700 more than what the Zero had, hauled the Hellcat up at a wild rate, 3,500 feet a minute. Fukui tried to follow, but the Zero just couldn't keep up. He watched his airspeed bleed away as gravity pulled him down. At 15,000 feet, the Hellcat did something that on paper a plane that heavy just shouldn't be able to do, a hammerhead turn, dropping it right onto Fukui's tail. The American fired at 400 meters, 6 machine guns, not the 4 they'd expected. The sheer storm of bullets was unreal. 17 hits tore through Fukui's Zero in 3 seconds. Somehow, by spinning out, he got away, barely. He limped back to Marcus Island, his plane shot to pieces. His wingman, Petty Officer Second Class Masao, didn't make it. Neither did the recon plane they were supposed to protect. The Hellcat had drawn first blood. That's the paradox. How did something so heavy become so deadly? October 5th, 1943. Task Force 14 hit Wake Island. Lieutenant Yoshio led a dozen Zeros from the 252nd Air Group to intercept what looked like another American nuisance raid. For months, the U.S. carriers had been lobbing these attacks and then running before Japanese fighters could really respond. This time, it felt different. Shiga wrote in his diary, "We climbed to 20,000 feet, 12 F6Fs below us, split into 3 groups. We had every advantage: altitude, position, surprise. We were sure we'd win, but everything fell apart. When the Zeros dove, the Hellcats didn't scatter or try to dogfight. They stayed in formation and eased into a dive, keeping their speed up. The Zeros opened up from long range, hoping for lucky shots, but the Hellcats just soaked it up. Their armor, over 200 pounds of plate for the pilot, another 100 plus around the oil system, self-sealing tanks, shrugged off most hits. As the Zeros burned through their ammo, the Hellcats counterattacked. Instead of turning and mixing it up, they used their weight. Full power climbs put them where the Zero's engine just couldn't breathe. At 25,000 feet, the Hellcat still had 1,650 horsepower. The Zero was gasping with only 900, the Hellcats dove in like hawks on sparrows, as Shager put it. They'd swoop down, fire all 6 guns, then climb away before the Zeros could react. 8 Zeros went down, not a single Hellcat lost. By November 11th, 1943, at Rabaul, the 204th Air Group's pilots gathered around Lieutenant Commander Tao Tanimizu for a briefing. Tanimizu, with 32 kills to his name, was one of the few who tangled with Hellcats and lived. "Forget everything you know about air combat," he told them. "Americans have changed the rules. They don't fight our fight anymore. They fight like executioners, not warriors." Japanese pilots were learning the hard way. The Hellcat wasn't built to outturn the Zero. It didn't need to. American pilots used something called energy fighting, keeping their speed and altitude up, turning that potential energy into vicious, slashing attacks. Zero pilots never got a chance to use their nimbleness. Tanimizu broke it down. They work in pairs, one high, one low. While you fight one, the other is already diving on you. Their radios, which we used to mock, let them coordinate perfectly. We fly as lone samurai. They fight like a machine. By December 1943, the technology gap was impossible to ignore. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who'd once led the attack on Pearl Harbor, now inspected battered Zeros limping home after Hellcat encounters. The difference in firepower was obvious. The Hellcat's 6 Browning M2 machine guns spat out 4,500 rounds per minute. Each .50 caliber bullet weighed 46 grams and flew at 2,900 feet per second, packing a punch of 3,500 foot-pounds. The Zero's 7.7 millimeter guns fired lighter bullets, 11 grams at 2,300 feet per second, just 750 foot-pounds of energy. Even more unsettling was the way Americans found their targets. Japanese pilots still relied on their eyes. Hellcat pilots, though, had radar controllers on ships who could see Japanese planes from 50 miles out and guide them right in. The old ways weren't working anymore. Lieutenant Sadamu Kumachi never forgot his first radar-directed interception. We were punching up through the clouds when they came at us. No warning. Couldn't see a thing. Hellcats came screaming down from above, right on top of us, like they'd known exactly where we'd be. Our altitude, our heading, everything. We might as well have been blind, stumbling around while the Americans saw everything in the dark. And this was January 1944, and the pilot crisis in Japan was spiraling out of control. Before the war, the Imperial Navy's training was brutal, 3 years long, and pilots racked up 700 hours in the air before they ever saw combat. Army pilots got 500 hours minimum. These guys were masters, aces at aerobatics, sharpshooting, and even trained in the spirit of air combat. But by early 44, the Navy was sending pilots out with barely 300 hours. Army guys, 200. Fuel was so tight, most training happened in gliders. Each pilot got only 50 rounds for gunnery practice. They cut formation flying, night training, radio drills, anything that would slow down getting bodies to the front. Meanwhile, American pilots rolled in with at least 300 hours, including 50 in the actual planes they'd fight in. They'd fired thousands of rounds, practiced carrier landings until it was second nature, and drilled energy tactics over Texas where nobody shot at them. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, who trained pilots at Kasumigara, summed it up in his last report: "We are sending children to fight professionals." He wasn't exaggerating. Just yesterday, Ensign Yamamoto reached the front lines. He'd never fired his guns in flight, no ammo for practice, never flown at night, no fuel for that. He died 7 minutes into his first combat. Fast forward to October 1944, the Battle of Formosa. Vice Admiral Shagaru Fukuome threw everything he had at stopping the Americans' carrier raids. More than 700 planes, the last of the trained pilots from home. The Japanese reports claimed huge victories. 26 American carriers and battleships sunk, 300 planes downed. But once the pilots returned and they checked the gun camera footage, the truth came out. The Americans lost just 89 aircraft. The Japanese lost 329 planes. Almost every veteran pilot left. Lieutenant Sadaki Akamatsu, one of the few who survived, wrote about it later. The Hellcats were everywhere, above us when we climbed, below us when we dove. They'd carved the sky into grids, each covered by a division. This wasn't combat. It was organized slaughter. Then came the Great Marianas. Turkey Shoot, June 19th, 1944, over the Philippine Sea. The Japanese Navy threw in everything, 9 carriers, 450 aircraft. Whatever pilots they had left, their plan was to crush the American fleet once and for all. On the other side, Task Force 58 waited with 15 carriers and almost 1,000 aircraft, half of them F6F Hellcats. Admiral Jaburo Ozawa sent his planes out in 4 waves, convinced the Zero's range and Japanese skill would turn the tide. The first group, 69 planes, went up at 8:30 a.m. American radar picked them up 150 miles out. Hellcats moved in, waiting at the perfect altitude, sunlight at their backs coming in from Japanese blind spots. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, who led the Japanese escort, saw them just before the fight. 60 Hellcats stacked from 20,000 to 30,000 feet, a steel wall. The Japanese were at 18,000 feet. Every advantage belonged to the Americans. The fight lasted 12 minutes. Of the 69 Japanese planes, 42 went down. Commander David McCampbell, leading Air Group 15, shot down 7 planes himself that day. His wingman, Roy Rushing, bagged 6 more. The Zeros tried to turn with us, McCampbell said. We just refused. We'd dive in, shoot, climb away. They'd try to follow, stall out, and another Hellcat would finish them off. By sunset, the Japanese had lost 346 carrier planes and 50 more from land. The Americans lost 30. That night, American pilots called it a turkey shoot. The enemy had been helpless. A few months later, October 24th, 1944, Battle of Leyte Gulf, Commander David McCampbell led 7 Hellcats from the Essex and spotted 60 Japanese planes heading for the fleet. The fight lasted an hour and a half. McCampbell shot down 9, 5 Zeros and 4 bombers. His wingman, Roy Rushing, got 6. I ran out of ammo after the 9th, McCampbell wrote. The Hellcat never let him down, not a scratch on his plane, even though they were outnumbered 8-1. That day made it clear air superiority had completely flipped. The Americans ruled the sky now. 7 Hellcats took on 60 Japanese planes and sent 15 down in flames. Not one Hellcat lost. David McCampbell pulled off 2 ace-in-a-day stunts, 7 kills on June 19th, then 9 more on October 24th. That earned him the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. But after the battles in the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, something broke in the Japanese pilots who survived. Their own military psychologists started calling it Hellcat psychosis. Admiral Ozawa, in his after-action report, admitted, the enemy's radar-guided fighter direction did what we thought was impossible. It turned air combat into an industrial process. The Hellcat pilots didn't fight as lone warriors. Each became a cog in a massive machine. Our pilots, no matter how good, weren't fighting planes anymore. They were up against a system. Pilot losses got so bad that by early 1945, the Japanese rushed new aviators through training, just 40 to 50 hours for Navy pilots, 60 to 70 for the Army. Kamikaze pilots, most had about 40 or 50 hours total. That's about a week's worth of training. Then came Okinawa, April to June 1945 Operation Iceberg. The Japanese threw well in 900 kamikaze sorties at the American fleet. The Hellcat wasn't just a fighter anymore. Now, it was the last line of defense against pilots who had no intention of coming back. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia led his Flying Circus division of Hellcats, and they shot down 23 Japanese planes during the campaign. Valencia's tactics, flying in groups of 4 in tight, coordinated attacks, made the old Japanese dogfighting moves almost suicidal. "We came up with what we called the mowing machine," Valencia said. 4 Hellcats flying side by side about 100 yards apart would rip through Japanese formations at high speed. Each guy covered his slice of the sky. We made one pass, climbed back up, and did it again. The numbers from Okinawa are brutal. Hellcats flew 38 combat sorties and claimed 2,351 victories while losing 249 planes. That's a 9.5 to 1 kill ratio. More important, they kept around 80% of kamikaze planes from reaching their targets. By 1945, the technology gap was just too big to close. The F6F Hellcat wasn't the same plane as before. Now it had water injection to boost power up to 2,200 horsepower, zero-length rocket launchers, better armor, and the K-14 computing gun sight that figured out deflection shots on its own. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, Japan's top ace, officially 28 kills, though historians say maybe 15, met the Hellcat for the first time in June 1944. He barely survived. "I tried every trick I knew," he wrote. Loops, rolls, everything I'd mastered in 200 fights. The Hellcat stuck with me, almost like it was bored. I only got away because the American forgot to drop his fuel tank before the fight. By the end of the war, Hellcats had shot down 5,223 enemy planes, lost 270 to enemy fighters, and racked up a 19.3 to 1 kill ratio. They made 305 U.S. Navy aces and were responsible for 75% of all Navy air-to-air kills. For Japan, the cost was devastating. Out of 18,000 naval aviators at the start of the war, fewer than 100 experienced combat pilots were left by August 1945. When Japan switched from elite aviators to kamikaze attacks, it was a grim admission. Hellcats ruled the skies. If a Zero attacked a carrier the old way, its odds were almost zero. The Hellcats would get it. But if the Zero became a flying bomb, suddenly the odds of hitting something jumped to 30%. The pilot died either way. At least as a kamikaze, his death counted for something, so reasoned Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the man behind the kamikaze program. On October 25th, 1944, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa escorted the first official kamikaze mission led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki and shot down 2 Hellcats, his 86th and 87th kills. The next day, Nishizawa died as a passenger, not a pilot. His transport was shot down by Hellcats from VF-14. Japan's greatest ace, helpless without his fighter, was brought down by the very planes he'd once outflown. And then the end. August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast echoed across Atsugi Airfield. Captain Minoru Genda, who once dismissed the Hellcat as brute force over skill, listened as the Empire surrendered. Around him, only scraps remained, teenage pilots with barely 40 hours in the air, planes patched together from leftovers, empty fuel tanks. That same afternoon, Ensign Clarence Moore, a VF-31, flying from the USS Belleau Wood, shot down a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber after 2 p.m., the last aerial victory of World War II. The Japanese pilot, probably not knowing the war was over, headed for the American fleet. Moore stopped him. 2 short bursts from the Hellcat's 6 guns, and just like that, the Pacific Air War was over. September 1945, Atsugi Airfield, As the dust settled, the first American planes to touch down after Japan's surrender were a dozen F6F Hellcats from the USS Yorktown. Japanese pilots, mechanics, and ground crews lined up along the runway, eager to finally see the machine that had haunted them for years. Lieutenant Robert Vasu, an American ace with 19 victories to his name, didn't just land, he put on a show. Loops, rolls, climbs, things that would have torn a Zero apart. The Japanese pilots just stared, speechless. "You have to understand," Vasu said through an interpreter, "this isn't even pushing it. With water injection in combat, it's 20% more powerful. This plane's built for 13 Gs. I've never managed to break one." After the war, Japanese engineers got their hands on a few captured Hellcats. What they found stunned them. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine had 2,840 precision machine parts, each one interchangeable with any other R2800 out there. The Nakajima Sakai engine? Everything had to be fitted by hand, and no two engines were quite the same. Jiro Horikoshi, the man behind the Zero, spent months studying the Hellcat. His conclusion hit hard. "We designed an aircraft for 1941. They designed an aircraft system for 1945. While we were perfecting the sword, they were building the industrial age." But the real shock came from production. Grumman's Bethpage, New York, factory ran 24/7, never stopping, not for a minute. Not at their peak. Workers rolled out a new Hellcat every hour. In just 30 months, they built 12,275 of them. The Japanese couldn't wrap their heads around it. In 1944, Japan built 500 fighters of all kinds. The US, 35,000. American factories pioneered things the Japanese had never even imagined. Workers followed color-coded instructions to snap together complex assemblies. Shifts never stopped, and quality barely dipped, even at that speed. The Hellcat didn't just win dogfights, it changed everything about naval warfare. Before the war, everyone thought carriers were fragile, that they had to strike first or die. The Hellcat flipped that idea on its head. Suddenly, carriers became floating fortresses ready to take on all comers. Admiral Mark Mitchell, in charge of Task Force 58, got it right away. "With the Hellcat, we don't need to find them first. Let them come. The F6F will destroy them at our convenience." That confidence let American carriers linger off enemy coasts for weeks, covered by a shield of Hellcats that made them almost untouchable. But it wasn't just about tech. The Hellcat embodied a totally different philosophy. Japanese doctrine prized individual brilliance, spiritual strength, and the willingness to die. The Hellcat was all about efficiency, material strength, and keeping pilots alive. Japanese flyers couldn't adapt. The idea of refusing combat when at a disadvantage was at the core of Hellcat tactics, but to a pilot raised on Bushido, that was unthinkable. Years later, in 1962, American and Japanese veterans sat down together at a Navy symposium to look back on the air war. Captain David McCampbell, America's top Navy ace, didn't mince words. The Hellcat won the Pacific Air War, period. It destroyed Japanese aviation and made our victory inevitable. Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most respected aces, answered honestly, "The Zero was a superior fighter. The Hellcat was a superior weapon system. We never understood the difference until it was too late. We brought swords to a gunfight and wondered why we lost." In the end, the numbers tell the story. The Hellcat racked up a kill ratio of 19-1 overall, 13-1 against Zeros. Grumman built 12,275 Hellcats in 30 months. Japanese factories turned out about 6,000 Zeros from 1943 to 1945. Over 5,000 American pilots trained on Hellcats. By August 1945, fewer than 100 Japanese pilots remained combat ready. Admiral Saburo Ozawa, who led the Japanese fleet at the Philippine Sea, put it best: "We laughed at the Hellcat because we didn't understand it represented not just an aircraft, but an entire civilization's approach to war. By the time we stopped laughing, our air forces had ceased to exist." Saburo Sakai lived until 2000. In his last interview, someone asked him about the Hellcat. His answer summed it up: "The Zero made Japan a great naval power. The Hellcat made Japan realize it was never as great as it believed. We thought we were samurai. The Hellcat forced us to face a hard truth. We were just men with old gear, staring at a future we couldn't stop. Every Japanese pilot who made it through the war did so because a Hellcat pilot decided to let him go. That's the harshest kind of loss. Staying alive only because your enemy feels like it. When the F6F Hellcat showed up, it was a beast, twice as heavy as the Zero, loaded with armor the Zero never had, running on an engine the Japanese couldn't dream of building. Its guns hit harder, its radars saw farther, its pilots trained harder, and American factories rolled them out faster than the Japanese could even imagine. At first, Japanese pilots laughed at it. They saw all that extra weight and thought it was a joke. What they missed was that every pound meant something. A country that could afford to keep its pilots alive. It wasn't weakness, it was power. By the time they figured it out, the laughter had dried up. All that bravado turned into hurried letters home, desperate suicide runs, and finally, nothing but defeat. The Hellcat didn't just outfly the Zero, it crushed an entire way of thinking about war. In the end, the side that built the better machine beat the side that only built better pilots. The Japanese pilots laughed at the Hellcat. The Hellcat laughed last. It always did.